Good morning, students. The topic that we are going to do today is barriers to communication. Now, what are barriers? These are obstructions which tend to distort the message that are being delivered from the sender to the receiver. It can lead to misunderstanding and conflict. The communication becomes ineffective due to the various barriers that are listed here. The barriers can be verbal or non-verbal, they can be psychological, organizational, personal barriers, physical barriers, cultural barriers, or attitude barriers. The verbal or non-verbal barrier. It denotes a barrier which is created due to the language and the symbols that might be used in an incorrect manner. The barriers are from the linguistic capability of an individual, and this might create a problem. The first one in this is semantic barrier. Semantics is the study of the right choice of words. The semantic network of the sender may be different from that of the receiver. Maybe the understanding level of the receiver is different than the sender. The symbols can have different meanings. A word can have different meanings and different contexts. Wrong perception also leads to communication problems. The technical jargon that is being used as the typical technical terminology can be misunderstood, and the actual meaning may not be delivered to the receiver. Another barrier that might be created is badly expressed message. It may be due to omission of the words that are required, inadequate vocabulary, usage of wrong words. The body language and gestures can also be incorrect. The gesture and posture may be wrongly perceived, and if there is no match between what is said and what is shown in body language, it might create misunderstanding. The next is psychological or emotional barriers. In case the state of mind of both the sender and receiver is not ideal, it might create a psychological or an emotional barrier. It can be due to premature evaluation. If a person has some kind of preconceived notions against the communication that is going to be made, someone develops a kind of an attitude towards what is being communicated, it might create a barrier. Poor retention may also be a psychological barrier. If one cannot remember what is being said for a long time, they are inattentive or not interested, it may create a barrier. The lack of attention may also create a barrier, that is non-listening of message if the receiver is preoccupied due to some kind of psychological disturbance. Next are organizational barriers. The policies of the organization may hamper the flow of communication between the people in the organization. The status of the person may also act as a barrier. If somebody is in awe or fear of the superiors, it might create a barrier. The rules and regulations, if they are rigid and difficult to follow, it might create a barrier. If the hierarchy is very complex in the organization, communication may get delayed and this may create a barrier. The facilities in the organization, if they do not allow free flow of communication in a clear and timely manner, it may act as a barrier. Next is personal barrier. The fear of the challenge of authority may create a personal barrier. That is a barrier which is inside an individual. The lack of confidence of superior, the unwillingness to communicate with people, the lack of proper motivation or incentives, all these might create barriers in the organization. Next comes the physical barriers. The distance between people may act as a physical barrier. Example is given here. The lack of time. If the superior is very busy and does not have time to meet subordinate, it may create a physical barrier. Too much noise, maybe the physical noise may create a barrier. External disruptions, that is high or very low temperatures, makes a person uneasy, it might create a barrier. Improper arrangement for transmission of the facts and figures, that might create a barrier. The poor seating arrangement or the poor office layout might create a physical barrier. And if the media that is used is not appropriate, it can distort the message. Next comes the cultural barriers. As the world is becoming more and more globalized and various large offices are there, they may have people from different parts of the world, and this difference in culture creates a barrier. because the basic values of different societies are different. The dressing, the religions, or lack of that feeling of spiritualism, or maybe the food, drinks, etc. The general behavior of people is different from culture to culture, which may create a barrier. The attitude barrier. Certain people they like to be left alone. They do not want to mix up with other people. Such introverts who are not very social, that may act as a barrier to communication. Some people have attitudes like they have a big ego problem or superiority complex, which now let's see what are the methods to overcome these barriers. Always clarify the ideas before you communicate. Keep in mind the understanding level of the receiver when you are communicating. The purpose should be very clear. Always consult others, try to understand them when you are communicating. Always communicate according to what the receiver requires. Understand the level of employees. It should be considered and adjustments should be made. Be aware of the language, the tone, and the content that is there in the message. The right tone should be adopted while you are communicating. Whether it's a happy situation or a sad situation, one should communicate according to it. Always convey things with the help, and always value the listeners when you are communicating to get the right response. It should be ensured that the message relates to the interests of the listeners. Ensure that there is a feedback. People should be encouraged to give a feedback so that clarity can be made in communication. Communicate for present as well as for the future goals. Always keep in mind that the future goals should be stated while communicating. There should be follow up communication also, so that things can be added on. And always be a good listener. If there is attentive listening, the communication would be understood in a proper manner and the quality will improve.